Let's pray. Dear Father in heaven, we thank you so much for the time that you've given us here to open your word together, to study, to learn, to grow, and to be a light to others. And we ask, Lord, for your Holy Spirit to be here to guide our minds. And help us as we look through the scriptures, especially Daniel 11, that we can understand these things and that we can use these things to reach others. Be with each person, be with us in our study, be with Heidi, and we pray this in Jesus' name. Amen. And my wife Heidi had her tooth explode, so she's in a bit of pain. That's why I was a little bit behind schedule getting set up. I had to take her to the dentist, so fun stuff. Now, we have gone through, now this study, if we want to just sort of review, is we've been looking at the connections between Leviticus 26 and the book of Daniel. That's what this study has been on. And in doing so, we've seen that there's this structural, linguistic, and typological connections. So the types that are presented in Leviticus 25 and 26 show up in the book of Daniel. We've seen the language show up in Leviticus 26 in the book of Daniel. And then this structural, which is part of the prophecies of Daniel, this structure comes from Leviticus 26, the 7 times. And we have moved, through these different prophecies, the vision of Daniel chapter 2, Daniel 7, I should say the dream of chapter 2, chapter 7, the vision of chapter 8, and the vision of chapter 9, which go together. And then also we have now chapter 10, 11, and 12. And one of the things that we haven't really dwelt on completely in this study is that chronological connection of chapter 10 to this period that goes from basically when the captivity is released, and that connection to the giving of the decree of Artaxerxes. We've dealt with it, but there's a lot of detail we've left out. And I have done that study more when in the study in the book of Ezra. So Ezra 7 to 10 specifically addresses Artaxerxes' decree, but the earlier part of Ezra also addresses the first and second decree. And we're not really addressing those things. But I think it is an important point that we have to always keep in the back of our minds, is that Daniel chapter 11 comes in a certain context. And so I want to look at that context again, because we have addressed it. And then we want to go to Daniel 11, verse 40 to 45, before we go back to the historical understanding of the rest of Daniel 11, and then the interpretation of that in the present truth, or the application in a present truth context. Now, if anybody has any comments or questions, remember you can always join in and ask those questions. And sometimes I don't have anybody here right now, so I feel like I'm just talking to myself and my cat. But so if anybody has any comments as we go through this, anything that I'm forgetting, anything that you think is relevant, please join in. So we know that Daniel chapter 11 has to do with the time of the end. And we actually have 3 times of the end that are addressed, but we often don't recognize it. And so if we think about what these would be, we have this time of the end, which we'll just mark at 537. You could mark 539, but we'll just put it there. So this is the end of the 70 years captivity with the accession of Cyrus to the throne. And this we can call the time of the end. So we have the time of the end up there. Now, of course, we have 1798. And these are addressed in Daniel 11, verse 40, this one here. But this one's really at the beginning of Daniel chapter 11. And then, of course, Daniel 11, verse 40b, and we're just going to read that, addresses this time of the end. So we could probably say that this is Daniel chapter 10. And we could probably, if we went back to 539, we could even include Daniel 11, verse 1. But this is Daniel chapter 10. And this here is Daniel 11, verse 40a. And this is Daniel 11, verse 40b. And I'm gonna change this here. I'm gonna put 539, just for the sake that I can put Daniel 11, verse 1 here. And then we can say this is all Daniel 11. But yeah, I could include Daniel 10, verse 1, dealing with 537, but Daniel 11, verse 1 goes back to 539. And now this, of course, we could say this is Cyrus, but this is also Darius, right? So I'm just going to put Darius up here. So that's Darius the Mede. And then in here, I'm not sure, what powers we would put here, but we know here we have a parallel, and this would be Reagan and Bush. And I'm going to go through some of this history because we obviously accept this to some degree, but there are things in here that we've forgotten about or that we've missed. And I think that those details, as I started thinking about it, I realized that those were some of the details that were the most important in interpreting the present truth application of this message. But also this here, we sort of had, we addressed it, but we really didn't understand the significance of it, or we neglected to mention some of the significances here relating to this time of the end. And this period here, without going into great detail, is this period from the fall of Babylon to the decree of Artaxerxes. And this has a series of decrees, what we call the first decree, the second decree, and here we put the third decree, and we'd even put over here the fourth decree. And these decrees under Cyrus, Cyrus's decree in 536, this is Darius's in 516, and then this is Artaxerxes. Artaxerxes' decree in 457. And these three decrees are repeated or typical of the three angels' messages that end the 2300 days. So this is going to commence the 2300 days. And then this one here, over here, we're going to get at the end of this one, you're going to get the end of the 2300 days in, I guess I'll move it over here, in 1844. So this is going to be the third angel's message. We're obviously going to have the second angel's message. And of course, we're doing the studies on these messages in, and we'd have the first angel's message over here. And I'm just going to do it like this. First angel's message. even though it's 1798, there's a parallel between here, which we're not going to really touch on. But we are studying this on Sundays. And then we have 1989. And in 1989, we also have these waymarks in this line, which I'm not fully going to address, other than I'm going to address what happens here at the beginning, because these are the parts that I'm focusing upon. So when we think about these times of the end, they're all related to each other. Now, we have these two, of course, which we would call in our history. That is, these times of the end, this deals with the beginning of modern Israel, and this deals with the end of modern Israel. This one here addresses something that's quite different, because you have, and we could put other times of the end and other lines on here, but when we think about the beginning of ancient Israel, we would deal with the Exodus. And when we deal with the end of ancient Israel, we would deal with the reform line that occurs in the time of Christ, that ends with the close of probation in 34 AD, but also the destruction of Jerusalem in 70 AD. So there's lots of different times of the ends that we could address. The reason why, to me, this one's important in this context of studying Daniel chapter 11 is that in Daniel chapter 11, verse 40, you have this one here, which is the reform line that ends the 2300 days that begins with this reform line. And this reform deals with the rebuilding of spiritual temple. This one deals with the building of the literal temple. They also have, these two have these captivities, if you want to look at it, the 1260 and the 70 years that precede them, that Ellen White parallels. So these two, in a sense, can come together to understand this history. But again, we're going to be focusing upon the time of the end and the events that unfolded in 1989 and relate them to these events here in 1798. But we also know that this history here starts Daniel chapter 11, because Daniel chapter 11 is going to be addressing this history here. So that would be the other reason. Since this one here is at the end of Daniel chapter 11, and this is at the beginning, then obviously these are the primary lines that we would look at to try to understand Daniel chapter 11. And we can see why Daniel chapter 11 begins with this history, because it ends with this history here. So that should be pretty obvious, but sometimes we just don't think about it, and we don't think about the significance. And I think as we go through, that significance should help us as we study these things. Now I'm going to read a few things, and I sent you some of these notes, and I'm going to bring them up. Now, there is, as many people have heard, there was this Adventist evangelist. He was an Australian evangelist named Lewis F. Weir. And Lewis F. Weir, in the 50s and 60s, wrote about the events which later were fulfilled in 1989. And he wrote about this based upon Daniel 11, verse 40 to 41. And we're going to look at these verses, and I want to address it maybe a little bit differently than you heard about it, though some of you may know a lot of this history. But there are things that some of us don't know, and so I want to address those things. So I'm going to put my Bible up on the screen here as soon as I enable myself to do that. Okay. Now, to jump into Daniel 11, verse 40 to 45, I mean, for many people, it's just too much. There's not a lot of, if you were going to give a study to somebody on Daniel 11, verse 40 to 45, and they didn't know Daniel chapter 11 at all, it would be kind of a leap to just go in there and do what we're doing. But we do have some idea about it. We do know that in our understanding of it, we have the papacy is the king of the north. Now, some of us know about the fact that Uriah Smith had a different interpretation on it. I'm actually reading some papers regarding this. It's not as clear cut, the differences that existed and between Uriah Smith and James White, as we would think. It wasn't like James White had one view and Uriah Smith had another view and that there was no overlap. There was an overlap of understanding in regard to some of these things. And where the difference lies, so we're just going to go back to verse because they would both agree to a large extent that the papacy is being referred to in some of these earlier passages. And so, for instance, in Daniel 11, verse 31, an arm shall stand on his part, and they shall pollute the sanctuary of strength, and shall take away the daily, and they shall place the abomination that maketh desolate. This is referring, the arm standing on his part. This is about the papacy. And they shall pollute the sanctuary of strength. So this has different interpretations by different people. But they shall take away the daily. So this would refer to some people. This would refer to the change from paganism to papalism that happened with the sanctuary of strength. There would refer to the Pantheon temple in a lot of people's interpretations of this. And he shall take away the daily. Of course, sacrifice is added. So this would be paganism. And so this would be France in connection with the papacy, conquering paganism. And they shall place the abomination that maketh desolate. This would be placing the papacy upon as the Roman Catholic Church, that part of it. So it becomes, this would be all these steps that happen, though it's this talked about in Revelation chapter 13 as well. So there's some parallels there. But the point is, Adventists would all be agreed, at least in James White's day and Uriah Smith's day, that this is referring to the papacy, the abomination that maketh desolate. And so we know that there's going to be all these events. I'm not going to go through all of this, but we would understand that this is all talking about the papacy until we get to verse 36, and it says, "And the king shall do according to his will, and he shall exalt himself and magnify himself above every god, and shall speak marvelous things against the God of gods, and shall prosper till the indignation be accomplished. For that is determined shall be done." Now, again, in this passage, there's the historical interpretation. We're not going to look at it completely. Definitely there's a present truth application, which we're not going to look at completely here at this point. We will later. But the thing about Uriah Smith is that he says about this passage, and if it said a king, it would be introducing a new power. The thing is, it doesn't say a king, it says the king, Hamelech. So ha means the. So when it's talking about the king, it's not introducing some new power. And we can see then that this is still the papacy. Uriah Smith introduces a different power here. So he has the king of the north, the king of the south, and he has this new power, which here he and this is where I need to look at Uriah Smith. So let's read what he says regarding this. So put that here. And I'm going to make this a little bit bigger here. And we need to get to Smith's Revelation. So here's what Uriah Smith says. A king magnifies himself above every god. The king here introduced cannot denote the same power that was last noticed. So we know the power that was last noticed was the papacy. For the specifications will not hold good if applied to that power. And I don't agree with him here. To me, it seems very obvious that the specifications do apply to that power. So he says, take the declaration in the next verse, nor regard any god. This has never been true of the papacy. God and Christ, though often placed in a false position, have never been professedly set aside and rejected from that system of religion. Now of course, he's taking this and interpreting it in a certain way. In verse 37, where it says, neither shall he regard the God of his fathers, nor the desire of women's, nor regard any God, for he shall magnify himself above all. The obvious context here is that he doesn't regard any God as being above himself. Doesn't mean that he doesn't believe in God. It's not an atheistic power that's being introduced here. He just interprets a passage contrary to the context. Now, he doesn't regard the God of his fathers. So, we can look at that and what that means. Nor the desire of women, nor regard any God, for he shall magnify himself above all. So the regarding of a God is nothing to do with recognizing that he exists. This has to do with giving honor to a God. And really, he is putting himself above God. So, and the God of his fathers, I would think in the context here, would be the Christian God. So if you're going to argue that the papacy does not regard the Christian God, obviously, then you would have to agree with Uriah Smith that this would be some other power. It doesn't regard the Christian God, and it doesn't regard any pagan gods. But this is not what's being talked about, because if it's the God of his fathers, it must be a Christian power in order to be referenced. It doesn't give a regard to it, to the truthfulness of it. So God and Christ, though often placed in a false position, he says, have never been professedly set aside and rejected from that system of religion. And of course, we would know that this is true. Now he says, three peculiar features must appear in the power which fulfills this prophecy. It must assume the character here delineated near the beginning of the time of the end, to which we are brought down in the preceding verse. And it must be a willful power. It must be an atheistic power, which I don't agree that it's atheistic. Perhaps the two latter specifications might be united by saying that its willfulness would be manifested in the direction of atheism. So again, he's putting a spin upon this passage that it doesn't really give. And now we know that the willful power that's been presented throughout the book of Daniel has been the papacy. It's been papal Rome. That's the power that's willful. So he says a revolution exactly answering to this description did take place in France at the time indicated in the prophecy. So here he's introducing France as this king. Now, to me, it's a real problem in doing so, in that it undoes all of the parallels that have been given in the book of Daniel so far. So all of a sudden, we're going to have this new power, France. Now, France, of course, is part of it, because the arms that stand on the papacy part at the beginning of the 1260 for the papacy is France. It's also France that's going to come and be represented as the king of the south. which is an atheistic power. But here he's trying to make this power here this atheistic power. Now, when we get to verse 40, because this is what we're going to look at. So I'm looking at Uriah Smith's view here first. So when he gets to this conflict between the king of the north and the king of the south, we're going to read this here, verse 40. And at the time of the end, so that's 1798, shall the king of the south push at him. So, of course, based on who you think the characters are, then you're going to have to make an occasion for who the him is. And then it says, the king of the north shall come against him like a whirlwind. So he has these two powers, the king of the south and the king of the north. And then he has this other power, which is the him. So when he comes against him like a whirlwind with chariots and with horsemen and with many ships, he shall enter into the countries and shall overflow and pass over. So let's look at how he explains this. After a long interval, the king of the south and the king of the north again appear on the stage of action. We have met with nothing to indicate that we are to look to any locations for these powers other than those which, shortly after the death of Alexander, constituted respectively the southern and northern divisions of his empire. The king of the south was at that time Egypt, and the king of the north was Syria, including Thrace and Asia Minor. Egypt continued to rule in the territory designated as belonging to the king of the south, and Turkey for more than 400 years ruled over the territory, which first constituted the domain of the king of the north. This application of the prophecy calls for a conflict to spring up between Egypt and France, and between Turkey and France. Now, this here in 1798, that 3, I think, is just a footnote that has not been minimized, which year, as we have seen, marked the beginning of the time of the end. If history testifies that such a triangular war did break out in that year, it will be conclusive proof of the correctness of the application, which I don't agree that it is conclusive proof of his application just because we have this type of war breaking out in 1798, because we have other things that could also fulfill other conditions, such as our understanding of what happened in 1798. We inquire, therefore, is it a fact that at the time of the end, Egypt did push or make a comparatively feeble resistance, while Turkey did come like a resistless whirlwind against him, that is, the government of France? We have already produced some evidence that the time of the end began in 1798, and no reader of history need be informed that in that year, a state of open hostility between France and Egypt was developed. To what extent this conflict owed its origin to the dreams of glory deliriously cherished in the ambitious brain of Napoleon Bonaparte, the historian will form his own opinion. But the French, or Napoleon at least, contrived to make Egypt the aggressor. In a skillfully worded proclamation, he, Napoleon, assured the people of Egypt that he had come to chastise only the governing caste of the Mamelukes for their depredations on French merchants, that far from wishing to destroy the religion of the Muslim, he had more respect for God, Muhammad, and the Quran than the Mamelukes had shown, that the French had destroyed the Pope and the Knights of Malta, who levied war on Islam. Thrice blessed, therefore, would be those who sided with the French. Blessed even those who remained neutral, and thrice unhappy those who fought against them. So this is his argument, that we have these powers. The king of the north, in this context, would then be Syria. The king of the south would be Egypt. And his argument is that since they were the king of the north and the king of the south, previously, based upon the territory that they had, they would continue to be the king of the north and the king of the south. The problem is, we recognize that the papacy really is the king of the north. It has taken over that territory to some degree. Now, of course, territories move and they come and go, but all of the characteristics, the empire, Alexander's empire that was divided, ended up spreading out and taking over all these territories that that Greece had. And then in its division, we know that we had the king of the north and we had the king of the south, Syria and Egypt. But eventually, Syria was conquered by Rome. So that kingdom eventually disappears. To introduce it now as a major power in the context of the end days makes no sense. You would have to then say that Israel is still a part of Bible prophecy. And we have taken the position as Seventh-day Adventists that with the destruction of Jerusalem in 70 AD, that Israel, even though it has some ancillary applications in some of the events that happen, can relate to prophecy. There's no specific prophecies dealing with Israel as such. It's always spiritual Israel. And so when we had literal king of the north and the king of the south dealing with Syria and Egypt, Israel, the land of Israel, was in the middle of this conflict. But now we can see that's not the case at the time of the end. The literal land of Israel, the king of the north has no geologic or geographical relationship to spiritual Israel in that context. And so we'd have to look at spiritually what is applied. Now, let's just turn briefly to Revelation chapter 11. And in Revelation chapter 11, we know that this is talking about the revolution that happens in France, the French Revolution. And in verse 8, we'll start at verse 7. And when they have finished their testimony, when they shall have finished their testimony, the beast that ascendeth out of the bottomless pit shall make war against them, and shall overcome them, and kill them. And their dead bodies shall lie in the streets of the great city, which spiritually is called Sodom and Egypt, where also our Lord was crucified. So we have here a satanic power, and this satanic power is, because it's a beast that ascends out of the bottomless pit, makes war against them. So this is dealing with the French Revolution. And their dead bodies lie in the street of the great city, which spiritually is called Sodom and Egypt. Now, Sodom represents the licentiousness of France, and Egypt, the atheistic nature of the French Revolution. So obviously we know that this is not talking literally. So if we're going back to Daniel chapter 11, and we're going to look at an understanding of who the king of the north and the king of the south is in 1798, you wouldn't be looking at Syria and Egypt as the king of the north and the king of the south. We'd have to look to different powers. But we know that the king of the north has had this description. The one that is talked about is this king that shall do according to his will. He shall exalt himself and magnify himself above every god, and shall speak marvelous things against the God of gods. That's Daniel 11, verse 36. And so we know that this has to be the papacy, because these are the characteristics that are given in Daniel chapter 8 and in Daniel chapter 7 regarding the papacy. So let's just quickly look at those passages. So we see in Daniel chapter 7 that the little horn that comes up, before whom there were 3 of the first horns plucked up by the roots, and behold, in this horn were eyes like the eyes of a man, and a mouth speaking great things. So we know that this is a reference to the papacy. And in the interpretation, in verse 25, and he shall speak great words against the Most High, and shall wear out the saints of the Most High, and think to change times and laws. And they shall be given into his hand until the time, and the dividing of time. And then we can also look in chapter 8, and it says about the same power in verse 10, this little horn power again, so it's the same power, though here it's paganism and papalism mixed together and switching back and forth. And verse 10, it says, and it waxed great even to the host of heaven, and of it cast down some of the host, and it cast down some of the host and of the stars to the ground and stamped upon them. So this is treading down. So this is referring to the papacy, this part of it. And when you see it, which is feminine, that's referring to the papacy. And then it says, yea, he magnified himself to the prince of the host. Now, this Hebrew is a little bit odd, but this is not, this is still talking about the papacy, even though it has the word he there, just because of the context in which it's in. I'm not going to explain, but this is, he magnified himself, and it doesn't really say he magnified himself. So anyway, I'm not going to go into the Hebrew here, but it magnified itself even to the prince of the host. And you could say that this is referring to pagan Rome, but it says, and from him the daily was taken away. So we dealt with this before, and then in verse 12, the host was given him against the daily. So we can see that this power, that magnifies, is of course the papacy. It's not some other power. So to try to place it as another power, to me, seems a rather weak argument by Uriah Smith. So when we go back to Daniel chapter 11, and we look at verse 40, his interpretation that at the time of the end shall the king of the south push at him, he would say, well, the him is France. Egypt comes against France. And then the king of the north shall come against him. This is Syria coming against France. So none of this here applies to what happened with the Pope in 1798. And since we believe that the capture of the Pope in 1798 really is what marks the time of the end, it's just a completely different interpretation. Now, you can see why this was attacked within this movement last year. The argument was that Uriah Smith had the correct interpretation because he was merely repeating the interpretation of, I believe it was Joshua V. Himes or Josiah Litch. Maybe it was Josiah Litch. I can't remember. Which was actually a view that wasn't even an Adventist view. It was a view that was a Protestant view of understanding Daniel 11, verse 40. So now, of course, if you argued back that way, you would see that this wasn't really an Adventist view. It was a view that was left over, and it was understood by the Millerites, because obviously they could not see the time of the end in our time. And they were looking back at history to try to interpret these prophecies. Now, we probably should at this point look at some other events. So we know that in our time, what happened in 1989 was extremely significant. If we were to take the view of Uriah Smith, we would obviously have to completely eliminate and downplay what happened in 1989 as having any part of any fulfillment of Daniel 11, verse 40. But the thing is, a prediction was made regarding Daniel 11, verse 40, based upon the understanding that we have. As I said, that was Lewis F. Weir. So he made this prediction, not as to the time. So he didn't predict the time that it would happen. He actually believed it would happen in the 1960s. And indeed, things were being set up for that to happen. But sometimes history takes a long time to happen. It doesn't happen as quick as we imagine. It should. Things unfold sometimes slowly, and God also intervenes. So many times, God's people could have been under a Sunday law, I believe, but God has intervened. One is God's people aren't ready, even though the world is ready, and Satan is ready, and the papacy is ready to put forth their effort, their power, but there's other issues that are involved that they don't have complete control over. Now, first thing I want to look at is actually it's a paper by a guy named Avro Manhattan, or a book. really. But this is just, I'm going to read the preface to the American edition. And let's blow it up here. Now, this book was written, I believe, in 1957. It was published then. One of the first books of Avro Manhattan's. Now, Avro Manhattan is a popular author who wrote to a great degree on what happened in the history of the papacy and its place in politics. And this is one of his first books, called The Vatican in World Politics. And obviously he's writing just after the Second World War. But it is very interesting, the things that he says. So I'm going to read this here. It says, within the last few decades, amid the rumblings and ruins of 2 world wars, the United States of America has emerged paramount and dynamic on the stage of global politics. From across the great land mass of Eurasia, Russia, the bastion of communism, equally dynamic in its struggle to build up a new political structure, is challengingly waiting for the tumbling of the old pattern of society. Confident that time is on her side. At the same time, the Catholic Church, seemingly preoccupied only with its religious tasks, is feverishly engaged in a race for the ultimate spiritual conquest of the world. But whereas the exertions of the USA and of the USSR are followed with growing apprehension, those of the Vatican are seldom scrutinized. Yet not a single event of importance that has contributed to the present chaotic state of affairs has occurred without the Vatican taking an active part in it. The Catholic population of the world, at that time 400 million, is more numerous than of the United States and the Soviet Russia put together. Of course, both these have grown in power, and as has the papacy. Americans have about 350 million people there, 330 million, something like that. And Russia, of course, has a large number of people as well. And this time, of course, he's talking about the USSR, the Soviet Union. So are more numerous than the United States and Soviet Russia put together. When it is remembered that the concerted activities of this gigantic spiritual mass depend on the lips of a single man, the apathy of non-Catholic American should swiftly turn to keenest attention. His interest, furthermore, should increase when he is made aware that the United States is intimately involved in the attainment of both the immediate and the ultimate goals of the Vatican. So he has a lot of insight as he's studying what's happening that should have been evident to lots of people, but wasn't necessarily so. Now, these goals are, for Catholicism, the annihilation of communism in Soviet Russia. So that's one of the goals of the Vatican. The spiritual conquest of the USA and the ultimate Catholicization of the world. Do these goals seem fantastic? Unfortunately, they are neither speculation nor wild and idle dreams. They are as indisputable and inextricably a part of contemporary history as the rise of Hitler, the defeat of Japan, the splitting of the atom, the existence of communism. Indeed, the inescapable alternative by which mankind today is confronted is not whether this will be the American or the Russian century, but whether this might not, after all, become the Catholic century. Surely then, the nature, aims, and workings of the Catholic Church deserve some scrutiny. The American citizen, perturbed by the past, bewildered by the present, and made increasingly anxious about the future, would do well to ponder the exertions of the Vatican in contemporary American and world politics, his destiny, as well as the destiny of the United States, and indeed of mankind, has been and will continue to be profoundly affected by the activities of an institution which, although a church, is nonetheless as mighty a political power as the mightiest nation on the planet. Now, one of the things I find about these statements, of course, how prophetic they are. But even then, in the context that we have of Daniel chapter 11, verse 40b, is that Uriah Smith, to a large degree, downplays the role of the papacy in end time events. And this is understandably so from the context in which he is writing. In Uriah Smith's day, the Catholic Church really had little power, especially in America. So the idea that the Catholic Church was going to rise to power again is something that Uriah Smith, he sees that it occurs, but to him it's not the biggest issue in the Sunday law crisis. And he's looking at what's happening in the news in his day, which is something that Lewis F. Weir tries to warn us about, is that we can't interpret prophecy, unfulfilled prophecy, based by reading the headlines. And now somebody may think that we are doing that when you look at what we are presenting. Somebody on the surface may think we've just looked at the headlines and had our predictions based upon what we see in the headlines. But actually, that's not really the case. These ideas that we have been presenting for years as Seventh-day Adventists are now in the headlines. And that's a difference. That is, we're not looking to the headlines to try to understand how we should interpret prophecy. We are looking at prophecy and understanding that what we have been talking about for years, for decades, are now being seen in the news, in the headlines. Now, the paper by, and I should have it here. Yeah. So I want to look for a minute at this other paper that I had given you by Swearington. Now, I don't know how many people have looked at it, but I need to. So he's going to deal with, and I don't have the page here, so I'm just going to move ahead. So we were following through his material to some degree to get the historical application. Now, this is a writer who's not connected with our message, and he's going to address some of this as well. You'll see that he takes a view that's very similar to ours. It's not identical when we get to Daniel chapter 11. Verse. So he's going to deal here with, if you could see that, I'll make this bigger. So he's going to deal with and address these sections dealing with 31 to 39. He's going to talk about Uriah Smith a little bit. And I just want to go back here. So he says, here's his interpretation of 33 to 39. So we'll look at this. So verse 31, arms shall stand on his part. So force used by the papacy to end Arianism. So this is dealing with the issues that happened from 508 to 538. The abomination that maketh desolate, the papal power who replaced pagan Rome as the new king of the north. So he has the same view that we have. The king of the north is the papacy. And the beginning of the time of the end, he has a 1798. And verse 36, these characteristics that Uriah Smith says can't refer to the papacy speaking marvelous things, description of papal blasphemy, nor the desire of woman, celibacy of the Catholic Church, honor of God his fathers knew not, exaltation, deification of Virgin Mary, and cause them to rule over them, exaltation of Mary and the saints, divide the land for gain, exploit dioceses for financial gain is his application of that. And so you can see that other people have understood these things. One is they probably have, to some degree, studied Lewis F. Weir, and they've also seen his prediction come true in 1989. So, so he's going to do this whole issue. He's going to address in here the idea of identifying the king of the north with the Seleucid Syrian power, and then show. We also discovered when pagan Rome conquered Syria, it replaced Syria as the new king of the north. So a similar transition also took place when papal Rome arose in the place of pagan Rome. So it replaces paganism as the new king of the north. So, and I'm just quickly I don't want to read everything here. He says here, we will discover that the king of the north of Daniel 11:40 is actually a description of the papacy in its resurrected phase during the time of the end, as described in both Revelation 13:1-3 and Revelation 17:7-11. To review, we have understood that the year 1798 would see the papal power receive its deadly wound at the hands of revolutionary France. The quotation below emphasizes this very significant event. Pius VI, 1717-99 Pope, and from the Pope 1775-99, whose reign ended in captivity by the French, marked the low point of the modern papacy. In 1798, French armies under the General Louis Alexandre Berthier marched on Rome and demanded that Pius renounce his temporal sovereignty. At his refusal, the Pope was taken prisoner and held first at Senna and ultimately at Valence, France, where he died. So, of course, we're familiar with this. But this, to me, should be where we mark the time of the end, and this should be the event. Now, he goes into some views here, which have a bit of truth to them. There's some differences. So he talks here about on February 15th, 1798, the 23rd anniversary of Pius VI's election, the French marched in and installed their puppet government. Frank Coppa, who also added that on the 10th of February, 1798, the French entered Rome without opposition. And shortly thereafter, on February 15th, the anniversary of the Pope's election, Berthier encouraged the deposition of the Pope as the head of the state and the proclamation of a Roman Republic. So there's a lot of details in here. Different people have used different dates, but I've always taken the February 15th date. It has a bunch of significance as well. In one is it's the 46th day of the year, and we know that 46 is a symbol of the period of years from 1798 to 1844. But it's also, if you count from January 1st, it would be day 45. And of course, the number 45 also applies to that history if you count using the end of the 1335, that is 45 years, which Miller had used. So now he's going to go into the Lateran Treaty. So a lot of people put the Lateran Treaty in 1929 between the Pope and Mussolini as basically the restoration or the healing of the deadly wound. Now, I would say that that's part of the process. We would see that the healing of the deadly wound would refer to the Sunday law, but I think this history is quite important, and we know that there's a bunch of history that happens between 1798 and our time that regarding the papacy that is important. One of them we looked at, not here in this study, but in other times, was in 1780, when on July 18th, that the Pope claimed papal infallibility. There's a document relating to that. So, of course, we have a double symbolism of July 18th in the 1870 is 187, and July 18th is 187. So it's kind of interesting that he chose that date. I'm not sure if he was thinking about it at all. So we know that there's a connection, and there are chronological connections between these events. We also know that in 2018, there was a lot made about the Catholic history, also dealing with the miracle of Fatima on which was October 13th, 1917, I believe, at noon, that this miracle occurred, connected with the Virgin Mary. So there's these counterfeit reform lines that the papacy has, and and this history has some significance prophetically. We're not saying that the prophecies that are connected with Fatima are true prophecies, but the Catholic Church is, through Satan, is manipulating history in such a way that they can make it appear that they're going to fulfill these prophecies. But of course, they're still false prophecies in that sense. So he's going to say here, in several past articles, Seventh-day Adventist pioneer Elder James White also confirmed that the last power in Daniel 11, that is the King of the North, must be referring to the Roman Empire in its papal phase. Adventist history will also demonstrate that Elder White and another Adventist pioneer, Elder Uriah Smith, presented differing perspectives on the identity of the King of the North. Having initially believed that the King of the North was the papacy, Elder Smith later changed his position by conveying that the King of the North would instead consist of the Ottoman Turkish Empire. In response to this change of position, Elder White noted in the 4 quotations below that the King of the North must still be referring to Rome. So James White says here, the field of Daniel's prophecy embraces 5 universal kingdoms. These are Babylon, Medo-Persia, Greece, and Rome, and the eternal kingdom of God. The ground of the 4 perishable kingdoms, reaching to and introducing the immortal kingdom, is covered by 4 distinct lines of prophecy. These are given in chapters 2, 7, 8, and 11. The 11th chapter of Daniel closes with the close of the 4th monarchy with these words, and they quote Daniel 11, verse 45, and to 12, verse 3. And so we'll just quickly look at those. And he shall plant the tabernacles of his palace between the seas in the glorious holy mountain, yet he shall come to his end, and none shall help. And at that time shall Michael stand up, the great prince which standeth for the children of thy people. So we're very familiar with this. And verse 2, and many of them that sleep in the dust of the earth shall awake, some to everlasting life, and some to shame and everlasting contempt. So we know that this is referring to the very end of time. And I shouldn't have done it that way, but anyway. So it goes all the way to the second coming of Christ. The Roman Empire goes all the way up to there. So he's making the same argument that I'm making, which to me seems very obvious. But Uriah Smith inserts the Ottoman Empire here in this prophecy in a way that the prophecy itself doesn't. Now, of course, the issue that we have today is that many people see that Islam is part of prophecy. And we know that from Revelation chapter 9. But we also can see that there is still a role for the papacy. Now, in it being this power that pushes at the King of the North and the King of the South, to me doesn't fit. And I don't understand completely Uriah Smith's argument, other than he's trying to address what he thinks is going to happen in regard to Turkey. And of course that makes sense, because Turkey at that time was still very much in the headlines. The events that were happening in the Ottoman Empire, even though it had lost much of its power as the sick man of the East, he still believed that there was a role for it. And of course we do too. We believe that Syria has a role as Islam, but we base that upon a different set of scriptures and a different understanding of Daniel 11, verse 40. But it is very compelling to many people. Now, I've seen many people take the King of the South, so there's other views. Some take that the King of the South is Islam, and I've seen other people say that the King of the North is Islam. So we really have, in Daniel 11, verse 40 to 45, we have basically 4 different views. There's the view that we hold, which Swearington also holds. And there is, of course, Uriah Smith's view that the King of the North is Syria, the King of the South is Egypt, and this other power is France. But you also have some other views, people holding that the King of the North is Islam, or other people saying that the King of the South is Islam. So you have these different views on Daniel 11, verse 40 to 45, which can be confusing for the average Adventist who wants to understand Daniel 11, verse 40 to 45. You have all these different views, and to me, they're just not comprehensive enough. They're very speculative, all these other views. The view that we hold is grounded in the understanding that has gone before. It's part of foundational Adventism. Now, somebody could argue that Uriah Smith is repeating either I think it's Josiah Litch's view. And so in that sense, it's an older view. But this is also a view that was held earlier by Protestantism. And it just doesn't fit. It ignores so many aspects of what we understand about prophecy, and these prophecies in particular. Now, you're going to see he has a few quotes here of James White's. Now, the one here I want to look at is this one where James White actually addresses Uriah Smith. He says, Elder Smith has given a very fine talk on the 11th chapter of Daniel, and his interpretation seems plausible. But if the legs of iron and the feet of iron and clay in the 2nd chapter represent Rome, and if the nondescript 10-horned beast and the little horn of the 7th chapter represent Rome, and if the little horn which waxed exceeding great and of the 8th chapter represents Rome, the king of the north represents Rome also. These are 4 parallel prophecies, brethren, reaching down to the coming of our Lord. Now, of course, Ellen White urged James White and Uriah Smith not to make this a public battle regarding who was right and who was wrong. So it wasn't something that was used as a testing message. But I think it did weaken our ability to understand Daniel chapter 11 because it became a much less studied, and always, if you did study Daniel 11, it could seem very speculative. You're speculating on unfulfilled prophecy. And so there's always this warning regarding this. And this one here is pretty good too. And there is a line of historical prophecy in chapter 11. So this is James White again, where the symbols are thrown off, beginning with the kings of Persia and reaching down past Grecia and Rome to the times when that power shall come to his end, and none shall help him. If the feet and 10 toes of the metallic image are Roman, if the beast with 10 horns that was given to the burning flame on the great day be the Roman beast, if the little horn which stood up against the prince of princes be Rome, and if the same field and distance are covered by these 4 prophetic chains, then the last power of the 11th chapter, which is to come to his end, and none shall help him, is Rome. But if this be Turkey, as some teach, then the toes of the image of the 2nd chapter are Turkish, and the beast with 10 horns of the 7th chapter represent Turkey. And it was Turkey that stood up against the prince of princes in the 8th chapter of Daniel. True, Turkey is bad enough off, but its waning power and its end is the subject of prophecy of John, that's the 5th and 6th trumpets, and not Daniel. And we would also include that it would be the 7th trumpet as well, that addresses Islam, even though it's in the context of the destruction of modern Rome, but we would see that applies as well. He says, to supplement Elder White's observations, which are absolutely correct, a resurrected papacy is also the final power mentioned in both Revelation 13 and Revelation 17. Again, the king of the north is the parallel of both the composite beast, whose deadly wound was healed, Revelation 13, 1-3, and the scarlet-colored beast, who supports the great whore called Babylon, which was and is not, and shall ascend out of the bottomless pit, Revelation 17, 1-11. Since Daniel and Revelation are sister books, we can conclude that the specific prophecies of Daniel 11, 40-45, Revelation 13, 1-3, and Revelation 17, 1-11, each describe a resurrected, resurgent papacy after 1798. And I think this is an extremely important point. If you're going to understand Daniel 11, verse 40a correctly, you need to see that it's marked by the deadly wound in 40a. You can't just have France fighting against Syria and Egypt. And he goes into a lot of these different symbols, which I'm not going to go into, but it's very sound reasoning. He deals with the direction and why this is significant. Symbolically, at the time of the end, why the king of the north has to be the papacy, because it fulfills that role of what the north is spiritually, and not literally, because we're not dealing with the literal land of Israel. And so he goes through all these references regarding the north. And so this is just some background information that he's going to go through. So now he's going to deal with Daniel 11, verse 40, the king of the north versus the king of the south. And in his view here, we're just going to read what he says here regarding the time of the end. And at the time of the end, the phrase time of the end will actually set the prophetic context of verses 40 to 45. We have already demonstrated that the time of the end actually began in the year 1798, when the papacy received its deadly wound by the hand of revolutionary France. Once again, Daniel was told to seal up the words of his prophecy until the time of the end. He was then told that the end or time of the end would come after the time, times, and a half. And he is applying Daniel 12:7 differently than I am. Obviously, Daniel chapter 12 addresses both the pagan part, which is Daniel 12:7, and the papal part, which is represented by the 1290. In other words, the end of the 1260 reign of the papacy would mark the beginning of the time of the end, which would extend from 1798 to the second advent of Christ. But that part of this prophecy, which related to the last days, Daniel was bidden to close up and seal to the time of the end. But since 1798, the book of Daniel has been unsealed. Knowledge of the prophecies has increased, and many have proclaimed the solid message of judgment. So we can see here that that's this quote from the Spirit of Prophecy, I believe, and dealing with the symbolism of Babylon. Yeah, it's a great controversy. And he's going to go back and deal with the 70 weeks and some of the symbolism there. So he says, according to the above passage, this 490-year period would begin with the decree to restore and rebuild Jerusalem, which actually took place in 457 under the reign of the Persian king Artaxerxes. Now, he doesn't understand as much as we do about that history, but he's taking a pretty typical Adventist view, which is okay. And then he's going to deal with Tiberius Caesar. He's going to deal with the covenant. And this is just some little point. And this is something I disagree with. If you ever run into this, this is often an interpretation I've seen, though I haven't seen very often. So I said it often, but not often. I've often seen this as an alternative, but it's not often that you see this anywhere. But Adventists use it, dealing with the 15th year of the reign of Tiberius Caesar. I just mention this as an aside because I've been dealing with somebody who has been and taking the view that, and this is an Adventist scholar, Andre Rias. He teaches at Avondale College. I might have mentioned him in Australia. And he takes the position that Jesus was baptized in 29 AD. And he bases that upon, because we do know the reign of Tiberius Caesar was from 14 AD to 37 AD. So if you take the 15th year of the reign of Tiberius, you would think, well, that's going to be 29 AD. Of course, the problem is in how these reigns are counted. And the common person would not have counted these reigns the way that modern scholars are. They would have understood the 15th year of the reign of Tiberius Caesar to be in 27 AD, because they didn't count the same way. And I'm not going to go and explain it, but they were using a Macedonian calendar, and they were looking at the way they counted it differently. So you wouldn't just add 15 years to 14 AD. You would have actually counted within that first his second year of reign would have occurred within that first year. And it's also saying the 15th year, which is an ordinal count, not it's not a cardinal count. So you don't just add 15 to 14 to get 29. But there's a lot more to it. I just don't have time to cover that. But that's just an aside. So we know that 27 AD, and he's going to deal with some of this stuff here. So here's what he says in this paragraph at the top of the page. These points all signify that the probationary time of literal Israel had expired in AD 34, which meant that Israel would then become a spiritual nation consisting of all true believers in Christ and not be limited to a geographical area or a specific biological group of people. And because literal Israel would continue in rebellion against God, their spiritual status with him would remain desolate even until the consummation, that is, the final destruction of sin and sinners. Therefore, literal Israel as a nation had lost their favor with God in AD 34 and will never again be reinstated as his chosen people. So to understand this argument, now he's talking about this indignation, which is in the book of Daniel. Now we understand that it's actually at the end in 1798 that we now have spiritual Israel rising up to become God's people. And after 1844, God establishes a denominated people, the Seventh-day Adventist Church. And he's sort of got this partly right. He doesn't work out all the details, but we see that Protestantism, the United States of America, has this opportunity to become God's denominated people. But it fails when it rejects the first angel's message. And so because of that, God then has this other people, which is those that accept the first angel's message and the second angel's message and the third angel's message. It's that group of people that form the Seventh-day Adventist Church, which is why the Seventh-day Adventist Church is God's denominated people. In 34 AD, at the stoning of Stephen, the Jewish nation closed its probation, and no longer was there God's denominated people existing from 34 AD until the rise of the Seventh-day Adventist Church. And I would place that in 1863. You could maybe put it a bit earlier if you wanted to, but having a denomination means a name. And so we were definitely denominated in 1863. And we were then God's denominated people for the first time since 34 AD. So he's going to deal with what happens in Daniel 11, verse 40 to 45. So he says, the king of the south shall push at him. Our text will be to identify the power called the king of the south. So he's already determined who the king of the north is. It's the papacy. Earlier in verses 5 and 15 and verses 25 and 28 of Daniel 11, we saw that the king of the south consisted of Hellenistic Egypt, since the literal nation of Egypt has no chance of becoming a major superpower in end-time prophecy. And the prophetic symbols of Daniel 11, verse 40 to 45 are global and spiritual in nature. We must search for a global spiritual meaning behind the prophetic symbol of Egypt as the king of the south, right? So he's going to go through and show some of the arguments that I've already used dealing in Babylon and Egypt, spiritual Egypt. So he's going to place that the king of the south is the USSR. So he has here this paragraph here. Some have thought that the horrific manifestation of atheism in revolutionary France from 1793 to 1797 was an actual fulfillment of this prophecy. Yet two reasons clearly show that this could not be the case. This event took place before 1798, and Daniel 11, verse 40 to 45 describes events after 1798. And after the year 1798, France would not become an atheistic superpower, even during the dictatorial reign of Napoleon Bonaparte. Thus, the former Soviet Union is the only empire that can fulfill the role of the king of the south after 1798. Similar to ancient Egypt, this powerful atheistic empire had pushed against the authority of the king of the north, the papacy, by openly denying the existence of God during its specific era as a superpower, 1945 to 1991. Therefore, we could rephrase this subpassage to say that the king of the South, Soviet atheistic communism, shall push at war against him, the king of the North, papacy. So there are some differences here, obviously, that you can see. He places this pushing of the king of the South that we would say is France in 1798, and he pushes it as referring to the Soviet Union as well. So, and I shouldn't say as well, he would just say that this is really the primary application of it. Now, that's not a view that we take. So we don't take the position that the king of the South pushing at the king of the North is referring to the Soviet Union. We refer to it as being France. And so we have these two steps. And we would agree more with Louis F. Weir. Now he has this, he refers to him here in the footnotes you can see there, in a book called The King of the North at Jerusalem. And I think I may have sent you that paper in an email, in the latest email. So it's an account on atheism in the French Revolution. So we can see definitely that it is an atheistic power, France is, in 1798, but it doesn't become atheistic after 1798, which I think is, it's a faulty argument on his part. But he's going to deal with the next part. And the king of the North shall come against him like a whirlwind, with chariots and with horsemen and with many ships, and he shall enter into the countries and shall overflow and pass over. So before we get into this part of it, we're going to take a short break. So we're going to come back at 12:30, which is in about 5 minutes or 6 minutes. And because one is I got to queue up some statements here. Now, hopefully everybody's staying awake with all this. I'm trying to go through this thoroughly, but also quickly, and sometimes that can be, there's just a lot of information. So hopefully everybody's following this. So I'm just going to pause this for now. Dear Father in heaven, we again just ask for your Spirit's presence as we continue our study. Help us to understand these things clearly, enlighten our minds, and help me to present this so that it can be understood. In Jesus' name we pray. Amen. So we're going to get back to these notes here. The King of the North and Jerusalem. So I have here, I'm going to have to blow this up a bit. So this is from Louis F. Weir's book. And I'll have to share the screen. So here's what Louis F. Weir says about this. It's the prophecy of Daniel 11, verse 43. So he's gone on a little bit in here. And there's some more details we're going to have to go through in this passage, but I'm kind of jumping ahead a little bit. Okay, I'm going to skip that. I'm going to start. The prophecy also declares, so Daniel 11, verse 40. At the time of the end shall the king of the south push at him. In support of the belief that Turkey is the king of the north, it says that in 1798, Egypt did push, or make comparatively feeble resistance, to quote Uriah Smith, against France. When we permit the Bible to be its own expositor, we learn from the use Daniel has already made of the word push, that it is employed to describe a power that is vigorous and successful in its campaign. In Daniel 7, verse 4, we read, I saw the ram pushing, and this should be Daniel 8, not Daniel 7. I saw the ram pushing westward, northward, and southward, so that no beast might stand before him, neither was there any that could deliver out of his hand. Egypt's feeble resistance of the French in 1798 did not fulfill the prophecy of Daniel 11, verse 40, and the king of the north that was prophesied to come against him like a whirlwind could not be that of Turkey's resistance to the French invasion of her territory. The belief that in 1798, Turkey was the king of the north and Egypt the king of the south seems very incongruous, because Egypt was then included in Turkish territory. Writing of Napoleon's invasion in 1798, H.G. Wells says, moreover, Egypt was a part of the Turkish Empire. Outline of History, Volume 11, page 584. Why should Turkey and territory governed by her vassal, be regarded as two separate powers? Which is a very good point. Another incongruity appears when applying the term the king of the north or the king of the south to powers conquering the respective territories. By this principle, when France occupied Egypt, it should become the king of the south. Thus, there would not be three powers to engage in the so-called Triangular War of 1798, as supposed fulfillment of Daniel 11, verse 40. So, we could go over a number of these sorts of arguments, but there's a point that I wanted to get to, and so I want to go back to Daniel 11, verse 40 to 45. Now, of course, we parallel these events with Daniel, of Daniel 11, verse 40 to 45, with Revelation 13 and Revelation 17. So these are parallel prophecies, which I think is one of the intriguing things about our understanding of Daniel 11, verse 40 to 45, is that we can see that it's giving us more detail regarding that history. Now, let's read over these passages and look how we interpret this, or how we understood this. We can take a look at it. Until about 2016, December of 2016, that we changed some of our interpretation, or we saw what we had missed. In a sense, our hand was held over a mistake in our understanding. So we're just going to do a really quick recap of Daniel 11, verse 40 to 45. And at the time of the end, shall the king of the south push at him. So we know that this is France pushing at the king of the north in 1798. And then this next verse brings us basically 91 years later to 1989. And at the time of the end shall the king of the south push at him, is 1798. And then the king of the north shall come against him like a whirlwind, with chariots and with horsemen, with many ships. And he shall enter into the countries and shall overflow and pass over. So to just jump, as we do, from 1798 to 1989, to some people that doesn't really make sense, but that history, of course, could have come sooner if things were different. But we have a time of the end in 1798. But we can also apply the time of the end to 1989. And that's another place that Swearingen and others don't do, and I didn't do in 1989. I saw Daniel 11, verse 40 being fulfilled when the king of the north, the papacy, comes against him like a whirlwind. And we all are familiar, at least I think most of us are, with Time Magazine's article, The Days of the Whirlwind, which is an article that explains what had happened behind the scenes with the United States, basically Reagan, and Pope John Paul II collaborating to help take down the Soviet Union. And the chariots, of course, refer to military power as well as horsemen. And the ships refer to the economic power that was used to take down the Soviet Union. Now, it's interesting too, some people may remember the use of the term Star Wars to refer to this fictitious um, anti-ballistic missile. Basically, the United States had fooled the Soviet Union into believing that they were actually going to be able to take down Soviet missiles from space. And the Americans did a ploy where they made it look like they actually were developing this capability, which would weaken the Soviet Union to the point where they would be unable to win a nuclear war against the United States. It's one of the things that was used. But there was also all kinds of sanctions that had been going on for quite a while, but continued. There was also, I'm trying to remember the name of it, but the solidarity movement in Poland under Lech Walesa. And there was all kinds of pressures that were happening that Pope John Paul II was able to place upon the Soviet Union, and and with the help of the United States, both of them took down the USSR. And that is documented in this Time magazine article, The Days of the Whirlwind. So we can see sometimes the language of prophecy shows up in the headlines. Now, he shall also enter into the glorious land, and many shall be overthrown. The word countries is added. But these shall escape out of his hand, even Edom and Moab and the chief of the children of Ammon. Now, so the he that shall also enter into the glorious land is the papacy, obviously, is the king of the north. And many shall be overthrown, referring to people, not to countries. Countries is added. But these shall escape out of his hand. And of course, that would be the context, because we see Edom, Moab, and the chief of the children of Ammon. Now, Ezekiel also refers to these nations, and they become symbolic of the world, the different people of the world who escape out of the hand of the papacy. And he shall stretch forth his land also upon the countries, and the land of Egypt shall not escape. And I've seen various interpretations of this, but this is just his control of the world, the United Nations, and the land of Egypt is a symbol of the world. So the world will not escape. So it'll be in control of the papacy. And he shall have power over the treasures of gold and of silver and over all the precious things of Egypt. And then we have these, and I've seen this variously interpreted. So the Libyans and the Ethiopians shall be at his steps. Now, the Libyans refer to the poor. It's one of the poorest countries in North Africa. And Ethiopia, like historically. And Ethiopia is one of the wealthiest, from where gold comes, the gold of Ethiopia, and so forth. And so we've referred to this as the poor and the rich. Being at his steps has been variously interpreted as well. So we're going to look at these things in more detail, and just kind of, so some of these people are following, both rich and poor are deceived. The rich and poor, free and bond, all these people receive the mark of the beast. And then it says, but tidings out of the east and the north shall trouble him. So the papacy is going to be troubled by tidings out of the east and the north. And if there's a lot here in this as well, of course, tidings out of the east, that would refer to Islam. Tidings out of the north would refer to, usually you would look at tidings out of the north as Babylon coming in. But if we look at the context of who the true king of the north is, this would refer to Christ. So different people have interpreted these differently, I know. But we also have other places where we can address this. Now we know Lewis F. Weir focuses a lot on this passage, tidings out of the east and out of the north shall trouble him, and he goes into the book of Revelation as well, and addresses these. And we're not going to have time today to do that, to look at everything Lewis F. Weir said, because he deals with the idea that the kings of the east refers to the coming of Christ. So there are some ways in which we can look at east, because Christ comes from the east. but he's also the true king of the north. And so tidings out of the east and the north can also refer to the gospel and to a message. So there's different ways that we can understand this. And I'm not sure, this time that I'm 100% certain which way I would go. But if you deal with the east deals with Islam, and the north dealing with Christ, or the north could refer to other things symbolically. Therefore he shall go forth with great fury to destroy and utterly make away many. So this is obviously talking about the future still from this time. And he shall plant the tabernacles of his palace between the seas in the glorious holy mountain, yet he shall come to his end, and none shall help. Now, we have this, the glorious land, of course, is being referred to here, and the glorious holy mountain. So we have in verse 41, he shall also enter into the glorious land, which we take as the United States. The other verse, I'm just trying to think which one it is. Stephen probably knows where the other verse is that we can use as a cross-reference to the glorious land. The pleasant land is the other reference. So it's the same word. When it refers to the pleasant land in Daniel, you know what I'm talking about, Stephen? This reference to the pleasant land?
Well, it mentions the pleasant land in Daniel chapter 8, verse 9.
Okay, yeah.
But does it not mention it again in...
Right.
Is that the one you think?
Speaking out of them. Yeah, so in this context, and out of one of them came forth a little horn which waxed exceeding great toward the south, toward the east, and toward the pleasant land. So that would be the glorious land, which in this context is Jerusalem. But we can see that it's a type of the United States. So the United States takes that role. So thanks for that, Stephen. I just couldn't remember where that verse was. So I'll get rid of the Hebrew there. Numbers. Okay. So this tidings out of the east and the north, as we said, has different interpretations to it. But when we get to this, he shall plant the tabernacles of his palace between the seas and the glorious holy mountain. This is, in some ways, I see it as a response to what has been happening. That there is this message. My view is this tidings referring to this message. By this message, I mean this message. Our message is the message that is going to trouble the papacy. And I don't think that can happen until July 18th, that they really can be troubled by it. I think that this is the issue. Islam becomes this issue and God's people. So we could look at the east as referring to Islam and the north as referring to God's people. So there's these two issues involved. We have these what's happening with Islam and what's happening with the true people of God. These are the things that are going to trouble the papacy. And therefore he shall go forth with great fury to destroy and utterly make away many. When he plants his tabernacles of his palace between the seas, it says, in the glorious holy mountain. Now, in Hebrew, it and other translations translate it differently. But I'm just going to show you the Hebrew here. So first I'll just put this, you have this word between, and you can see there's the word between, which is ben, and seas, the yam, and the glorious holy mountain. Again, you're just going to have that word Sibi, and holy Kodesh, right, and mountain. So it doesn't even, holy, and then mountain is har, right? So you got these Hebrew words strung together here. Now, what you don't see when you look at something like this is you don't see, they just show you the form of a word. So when you look at something with your, your Hebrew Strong's number, it doesn't tell you anything about the form of the word or other things that are added to it. So when I go to the Hebrew, I go down here, and you can see these same words. There you got between, and there's the word bein, and yam, and then you got this word, and it says in the glorious holy mountain. Now, you might not be able to see this. I don't think I can blow it up more than this. I think if I click on this, it'll just go smaller. Yeah, so that's the best I can do. But this letter here in front of Har is mountain. But you see this letter here. This is called a lamed, and a lamed is it's a prefix. It's affixed to the beginning of the word. And if it was going to be in the glorious holy mountain, as you see in the King James, you would actually have a different letter in front of the word Har, which is mountain. You would have the letter bet. Now the bet is the letter B, and it means in. So a palace between the seas in the glorious holy mountain, because it's the word mountain that is attached to the word here in, but of course the word order is different. But the letter lamed means against. Literally, it would mean to. So if you wanted to translate this literally, that word between, he shall plant the tabernacles of his palace between the seas to the glorious holy mountain, which wouldn't make much sense in English. But it would be better to translate it as against. That is, you have two different things. You have the seas, which is the people, and the glorious holy mountain, which is God's church, God's kingdom that's being set up. And the papacy is planting his tabernacles between the people and between God's church. So this is what this verse is talking about. And this is what Lewis F. Weir emphasizes in understanding Daniel 11, verse 45, the role of what this glorious holy mountain is. And then it says, yet he shall come to his end and none shall help him. So we can see that this is not a reference to, if you're going to try to apply this to Turkey, you have some real difficulties in addressing this passage. Now, I can't remember exactly how Uriah Smith foresaw what was going to happen, because it's been a long time since I read Uriah Smith's view on this. But what he predicted regarding Turkey didn't occur in the way that he imagined. And his understanding of these verses really didn't come to pass. So most people just eventually abandon Uriah Smith's view. The only reason why it's having a resurgence now is in response to our view. And that's why these other two views have also come into play. So I'm going to try to illustrate this a little bit. Now, I didn't get as far as I thought I might, but that's kind of typical. So when we look at, obviously, this Daniel 11, verse 40a, and Daniel 11, verse 40b, we can definitely see that these two are connected, these two histories. Lewis F. Weir is connected, and so is Swearington. But they have not placed this as being a time of the end, as the beginning of a reform line, because it's not something that they understood, but it is something that we understand. And we can see that this three decrees and these three angels' messages also repeat in our history, and they do in every reform line. Now, we would probably, make this 1991, and if we look at this history, we always say that the first angel arrives here in 1798. but really I think it is a period of time. And where this, because what you get is an increase of light. So you can definitely say that an increase of light has begun at each of these points of time. Babylon falling, there's now an increase of light on what's going to be happening. 1798, the Pope being taken captive. 1989, the fall of the Berlin Wall. But there still is a period of time in here, in all of these histories. You can see it clearly here. You can see it 1798, and then the Pope dying in 1799 on, what is it, is August 29th or something like that. Right, so you have that period of time in there. And then here in this period of time, we have November 9th and December 25th. So we got dates here. And then we could put a date here, October 13th. And Cyrus coming to the throne, all we know is it's in the fall of 536. We don't have an exact date. But we can see that there's these periods of time here at the beginning, which we could call this the time of the end. This is these events that end up making the time of the end. And then we know under Darius's decree, now this is going to be, I'm going to be dealing with some of this a little bit on Sundays. But I just want to deal with this part, dealing with Daniel chapter 11, verse 40b to 45. So when we read about this, we know that this marks the time of the end. The papacy and the United States combine, and they overthrow the Soviet Union. And that's where we were at. That's what we believed. And then we started to, in this history, we have, 9/11, and we keep going on. So we see these prophecies begin to be fulfilled. But we have in our history this understanding that happened in December of 2016, that they only came up to the neck. And we're going to see this as we go through Daniel chapter 11. We already started to last time. But there's this overflowing scourge, this overflowing. And we can also deal with the king of the north. If I was going to, look at another line of history, is I would look at Isaiah chapter 7, to sort of parallel this. But it occurs in other histories as well. But the idea of Assyria and the role that Assyria had in, and just to sort of tie that in, because that is going to deal with the fall. And the reason why I tie that history in, so I'm gonna go here. And just for lack of, I would go 742 to 723, maybe 721. But this history of this civil war that occurred, which starts the prophetic mirror, but it's this year 723 that we can connect to 1798 by the 2520 for Northern Israel. And so this history also has a bearing upon this. And it's in this history where we have Assyria coming in, and it overflows. But there's just a lot here dealing with this that we're going to have to look at. So this history is also related to this history. It's a time of an end as well. But not really a reform line for Northern Israel. But anyway, I'm just going to take this out. So we know that the Soviet Union fell, and we believe that Russia fell. But Russia didn't. Russia continued. And so we come to an understanding in our history that what the book of Daniel does is Daniel 11, verse 40 to 45, gives us this history, and then it gives us the history of the Sunday law. And it connects us with the beginning of this reform line. But we just looked at the one battle. The king of the north is going to conquer the king of the south. And here the king of the south pushed against the king of the north. And that's it. We weren't looking for any other battles between the north and the south. We just saw the Sunday law is going to be coming. The United States is going to be controlled. The whole world will be controlled. Egypt will be controlled by the papacy. But when we started to understand that we could the first step that we had is we understood that we could look at Daniel 11, verse 1 to 4, and see that the beginning of Daniel 11 also spoke to our history. And that is, it gave us this reform line based on this. We could look at this line and line it up with this line, right? So we could look at the kings of Persia and see how they were related to the kings of the United States. And we already did that. So that the presidents, Reagan, Bush, Clinton, etc., all the way up to Trump. And Trump would match Xerxes, and then from there you would then have Greece come into play. So, and we're gonna deal with that in more detail, obviously. But the point is, we now know that we can look at the rest of Daniel 11, and it provides us with more detail in this history. And that's what we're trying to do as we're looking at the present truth application of Daniel 11, where before we just had the historical application. We went through, we came up to 1798, we jumped to 1989 in Daniel 11:40b, and then we just went on to the end. But now we realize that we can go back to the book of Daniel and see when Ellen White says that the history in connection with this prophecy, the book of Daniel, would be repeated, that it's not that the prophecies of Daniel are repeated, but that history in connection with these prophecies are being repeated. That is, that history, as it's fulfilled, becomes an illustration of this history. And it repeats each of these sections in Daniel chapter 11 that we're looking at are going to be showing us this history. Now, the next set of notes I want to direct your attention to is a set of notes that was sent to me back in 2017, I believe, a tableau. And this set of notes I'd sent to you as well. And it's a paper entitled Daniel 11, verse 23 to 29. So it was a paper at that time that tableau was promoting. Not sharing properly. There it is. Okay, so and we're going to take a look at this, not in detail today. We're going to be going through this. Now, this was in 2017. This was the study that they had done at the conference in Romania. At that time, I was at the School of the Prophets doing presentations on biblical chronology and on Samuel Snow's letters. So it's kind of interesting, the history of this, of what was happening in Romania at the time. Now, I believe these were Tableau's notes that he presented. And he gives this nice overview here of, and the thing about it, when I looked over this, it seems to me that the light that was coming on Daniel chapter 11 was for the most part correct. but there was this undermining that was starting to occur within the movement, that we were unaware of why some of these views were then set aside. And Parminder ended up being the one who really derailed the whole Daniel 11 study, even though in some ways they were keeping some of it, Raphi and Panium, but everything he was doing was actually undermining our understanding of Raphi and Panium. So it was very clever, if you want to use that word, for something evil, on how they were addressing the issue. He didn't attack it in a straightforward manner. It was in an underhanded manner that Daniel 11 was derailed. So, if you think something's error, you should stand against it openly. You shouldn't do it secretly and behind the scenes. Because if you have truth, truth will prevail. Only when somebody has error do they work in a clandestine manner to undermine the views that they disagree with. So anyway, we have Daniel 11 verse 1 to 4. So that's the Medo-Persia and transition to Greece. So that's the last 4 presidents of the USA. That's the application that we have. And then Daniel 11 verse 5 to 10. And we studied some of that last week. The rise of the Seleucid kingdom, the treaty with the king of the south, which is the Ptolemaic kingdom, war between the 2 kings, won by the king of the south, and the Patriot Act. We would parallel with that at 9/11 to the Midnight Cry when America defeats Russia. So some of this I'm not sure what he's exactly referring to as it being the Midnight Cry at 9/11. So I'd have to look at what he says more about that. Now Daniel 11 verse 5 to 16, we know that's Greece and the transition to pagan Rome. So he's going to parallel this to 538 AD, to the Sunday Law, to that history. Well, I see what he's saying in the one above there. So when he says defeats Russia, he's referring to the future, not, I was thinking 1989. Didn't make sense to me. Okay. Of 538 to the Sunday Law, so he's talking about the period of time or span that it has, with emphasis on midnight cry, and Sunday Law. And there's a good reason why you would do that. Now in that, of course, we have the Battle of Raphia, the Battle of Panium. And so this is the history that we've been looking at primarily. If we want to talk about our lines, we're always having Raphia and Panium on our lines. We had different ways we looked at it. That's Daniel 11, verse 5 to 16. And I would probably put it actually 11 to 16, but that's what he has there. And then Daniel 11, verse 16 to 22, he's going to look at the emperors of pagan Rome, which also typify the last 4 presidents of the United States. So Elder Jeff has presented on this in the past, some very profound ideas there. And then Daniel 11, verse 23 to 29. Now this was a presentation, an idea they were pushing for, that I don't know how well it was accepted within the movement. People who probably were involved in these European camp meetings might know more about these issues relating to Daniel chapter 11. But I personally wasn't involved in any of this discussion in 2017 or 2018. And by the end of 2018, it was obviously over. We weren't really talking about it in that way. And there's new emphasis came. So Daniel 11 was kind of set aside. But this Jewish League, the destruction of Jerusalem and Constantine. So the destruction of Jerusalem that's referred to here, and I'm not sure if this is referring to, and I think based on what I remember that Tabo presented, he looked at the destruction of Jerusalem as not the destruction of Jerusalem in 70 AD, but I'm not certain if that's what he's talking about here. I'd have to look at further in the notes again, because I know that he dealt with this idea that the temple, there's 3 temples, Solomon's temple, for lack of a better word, the second temple, and then the third temple under Herod. But I don't take that position. I don't take that there was only 2 temples as far as I was concerned. But I'm not sure what he's referring to, the destruction of Jerusalem. It could be 70 AD. And then he's comparing this with the SDA union with U.S. government, Russia being defeated, the Constitution overthrown, and the Sunday law. So there are some issues that they were pushing for within our movement in 2017 and in 2018. And these issues have to do with the idea of this new movement that was organizing, and that it was going to replace the Seventh-day Adventist Church, because the Seventh-day Adventist Church would join with Babylon. The idea then is that we would have this new movement and call people out of Seventh-day Adventist Church, just as you would call people out of Babylon. So there was problems with those ideas I saw at the time. We used a lot of language that the Seventh-day Adventist Church is not Babylon, but really we were teaching a doctrine that was basically saying the Seventh-day Adventist Church was Babylon. So it was more a semantical argument. Now, of course, Daniel 11, verse 30 to, I would put 31 to 39. He's got 30 to 40. It's the rise of the papacy, the persecution through the 1200 years, and the deadly wound. So they're going to parallel this with the removal of the Constitution, the establishment of religious tyranny, reemergence of persecution, and the fall of the papacy. So they're going to use the deadly wound is going to parallel what's going to happen with the papacy at the end. And then, of course, Daniel 11, verse 40 to 45, the rise of modern Rome. Now, there's a lot of ideas that were then presented at this time that I had trouble with when they were presented. You know, I never spoke out against them or anything. It's just there were things that I just felt that were loose ends. It wasn't like I thought they were teaching error, but there was loose ends, things that didn't really make sense. They seemed to be contradictory. And we started to line up lines that, to me, were not consistent. You know, and I probably should give you some examples of those things. But one would be, you know, taking, you know, symbols of other nations. Let's say Babylon, and lining Babylon and the United States, putting the United States as the king of the North, or putting the United States as I can't think of some of these studies I've seen because I didn't understand them or didn't agree with them. I can't remember all the details. But we just started making lines that weren't consistent. Now, one of the arguments that's been done against chronology is that I don't use line upon line, which of course is not true if anybody's actually looked at any of my lines. It's always been line upon line. It's always been in the context of reform lines and progressive destructions of 4. And I've actually developed it in a way that I can check the line, so to speak. A line needs to have a context within a structure. That is, lines don't just show up out of nowhere. They're always a part of another line. And I think that was part of the problem that was happening, is people just felt that they could make lines or make applications without understanding the context of where they were placing that line. You can't just put a line anywhere you want. That line needs to be, you know, a part of a structure. So you can have a reform line within a reform line, but it has to have a specific function within that reform line. It's part of that reform line, and it has to speak to the whole, everything that's in that reform line. That is, it needs to make that bigger reform line that it's a part of, it needs to make it make sense, help it make sense, make it clearer. And so I saw a lot of this type of thing happening. The same problem I had with Tess's lines is it, to me, wasn't line upon line. And it was very speculative, very much cherry picking, even though there was things that were quite intriguing about it and things I think that were correct. There was a mixture of, for lack of a better word, methodology. There was this new type of methodology, which really wasn't line upon line at all. And yet my stuff was attacked as not being line upon line when it very clearly was. So this was kind of interesting to me. It was kind of intriguing, actually, at the time, of how they could even bring a criticism against what I was doing chronologically and say that it wasn't line upon line. Now, often I wouldn't place the lines in there. That is, I wasn't marking out all the waymarks every single time, because I thought it was assumed. Because even if we look at the chronology that we had with November 9th, October 13th, all of these I had originally placed where the time of the end was, whose line it was. Now I think there's some more refining, and we're going to see that on Sundays as we start to go through these lines, especially when we get to not from the Millerite lines and we start to look at our line. I think there's some really clear evidences that we have that show the lines of the priest and the Levites and the lines of Samuel Snow, that we can see exactly where those lines are in our history and who they are. And I think that we can make that really clear, and we can see that we've been misled. And one of the things that we've been misled about is our movement itself, what our movement is. And I think that has not been removed completely, because we look at our movement as a departure from Adventism. At least that's the way that it was portrayed, that we are now this new movement. And you can see that in the new movement, the Omega movement. It is basically saying that dispensationally, it's not connected to Adventism at all. They don't take Ellen White as her writings as applying to them, and that was the direction that they were going, though we didn't see it. So we need to see that we're not a separate line, that our line is, if we look at it here, we can see that this time of the end and this time of the end are here connected. They're both reform lines, but this reform line is a part of this reform line. It's not a separate reform line. And I'm going to deal more with that on Sundays. I don't really want to do it here, other than to say that in every three-step testing prophetic message, every major reform line, especially something like the 3 decrees, there's always a fourth that ends up leading to an apostasy, where you have a progressive destruction of 4. And this one completes with the 70 weeks in the reform line of Christ. In our history, at the end of the 2300 days, we're also going to have a reform line that's going to fail in 1863, which is the center of it. But this reform line then is going to be completing this reform line. When we take a reform line like this and we put it underneath, it doesn't mean that we somehow say that this is now a separate reform line completely. We can parallel this with this, just like we can parallel the reform line of Christ with this. Now, of course, the reform line of Christ is the ultimate reform line. It's the reform line around which all other reform lines exist. Even the Millerite reform line is dependent upon the reform line of Christ. They just didn't know it. And you don't, without Christ's, without the midst of the week, the Millerite history isn't fully understood. That chiasm of Christ is what unlocks Millerite history. And we're dealing with that on Sundays, unsealing the 7 seals, and we'll see that. But just dealing with this history of 1989, these times of the ends, we know that Daniel 11 is going to give us more detail about what's happening. And we need to make sure that we're applying it correctly. Because we had all of these ideas introduced into this movement, and some of them we haven't removed, they're still there, they're still influencing us. We need to recognize what they are. And I don't think we have completely. I think maybe Elder Jeff has recognized most of them. And I think he understands much more than we do in a general sense. I think that most of the people in the movement can't actually appreciate everything that Jeff has presented. I don't think we have the knowledge or the background to do that. I don't think I do. I don't think I can understand everything that he says. But I do think there are still things that I can see that maybe he can't. And that's just because of my perspective is different. It's not that it's better. It's just a different perspective because of where I came into the movement and my approach on chronology and my approach on the lines that hasn't really been completely recognized. So I think that as we move ahead and we start to sort through Daniel chapter 11, we'll start to see some of these things that we still are holding on to that we're not aware of, that are error. Same thing will happen on Sundays when we start looking at the lines of the priests, the Levites, etc. And especially in the context of Samuel Snow's letters. Samuel Snow's letters become extremely important. The other thing that we have to understand, if we want to say we have to understand something, is really the role of Ezekiel. And of course, to me, Ezekiel and Snow are the same. But there's so many things in Ezekiel, and especially when we just deal with the one thing that we were talking about, that these shall escape out of his hand, Edom, Moab, and the chief of the children of Ammon. We see that Ezekiel addresses this as well. And we haven't really resolved this because we have the escapee and we have the time when Ezekiel is dumb. It has not been fully addressed. There's so much in Ezekiel connected with the prediction of Ezekiel that we have not yet unpackaged. It's been dealt with in a cursory way, but it hasn't been dealt with in all of its detail. And what I see is we approach studying it, but something just draws us away from it. An illustration that kind of just comes to my mind about that. I remember once I was backpacking, and I went into a place that was closed, but they allowed me to go into it up in Jasper, a place called Moline Canyon. And I had to cross the Moline River. And the reason it was closed is the bridge was out, and there was no way to cross it except to wade through it. And I know this is completely aside, but it's just something it reminds me of, is that I would come along near the banks of Moline River thinking that this is where I was going to cross, and then the path would lead away from it. And then, an hour later, I'd come back again, I would see the river, and then the path would lead away from it. And it kind of psyched me out. By the time I got to the river crossing where I had to cross, I really didn't think I was going to be able to cross it safely. So I wrote a note, put it in my backpack in a plastic bag, and then carried my backpack over my head across this rushing river, and managed to get across. But it's sometimes like that, is that I see that God has his hand, is that there's this approaching disaster happening. And we keep getting closer to it, and then we keep wandering away from it and closer. But one day we're going to have to face the truth. And I think that the truth that we're going to have to face, the thing that we're avoiding, is something that we're not going to like about this message. And I think that's why it's avoided. Not intentionally, that people realize that that the truth is going to be difficult. But I think it's just a reality that maybe God is preserving us in some way. Maybe we're not ready to see the truth. But I think that when we come to see what this message is about, it's not going to please us. That's just my thoughts on it. It's not going to be what we wanted, because what often people have wanted in this message are not really the right things. We've seen so many people who have wanted power. They wanted position. They want a special place by the seat of Christ's right hand. They want to be a leader. And yet, I think what this message is actually telling us is that we have maybe a special place in God's kingdom, but that our place, the movement of the priests, if you want to put it that way, doesn't have the place that we imagine in our mind. It doesn't have the glory that we think we might have. And I'm not saying that all of us are looking for glory, but I think that there's going to be a cross to bear. It is going to be very, very difficult. And that's just my impression of what I've seen as I've come close to understanding what God wants to reveal to us. So it's not going to be, walk in the park, so to speak. It's going to be a very difficult time that we're facing. And that's what I want to understand. I want to be as prepared as I can for July 18th and the events that are going to follow. And I think that's why this study in Daniel chapter 11, and also the study on the lines, dealing with Millerite history in our line, are so important. So that's basically all I have to say today. We are going to look at this paper and some other papers. It's just 1:27 here, so just a few minutes. Any final comments before we close with prayer?
Well, for me, it's been very helpful. I appreciate the time you're going into this.
Okay, well, thank you. Yeah, I hope it would be helpful. Yeah.
The Time magazine article was called The Holy Alliance.
There's the Days of the Whirlwind, which
That was a Newsweek article.
That's Newsweek. Okay. So the Newsweek article and the Time is the Holy Alliance, and it's Newsweek that does the Days of the Whirlwind. Okay.
Yes.
Thank you for that, Stephen.
No, thank you, Theodore. It was really good.
Okay.
Really thorough.
You're welcome.
Thanks. Appreciated that.
And just one thing, you have 530, you have 536, you have Cyrus in the fall. I think you mean at 537.
Yeah, I agree. If you're going to go to the fall, it's 537.
Yeah.
If anybody wants to update their diagram, the fall of 537. Yeah. Well, thanks everyone. I appreciate your time, and let's just close in prayer. Dear Father in heaven, we thank you for the light that has come from your word. And we ask, Lord, for the faith and the strength to walk in that light. We know at times we may have to walk through the valley of the shadow of death. Because of the light that you put into our minds and our hearts, we know that we can walk through that because you are always with us. Mm-hmm. Your rod and your staff will guide us. And we just pray, Lord, for each person. Help us to be faithful in the trying times ahead. We pray this and thank you in Jesus' name. Amen. Well, thanks everyone. And on Friday nights, I don't always send out the email, but and I know some of you, of course, can't participate in the study. The Friday nights at 7 Mountain Daylight Time, we have a study here, which I've been doing studies on some of the old prophecies. You can watch the videos though, if you can't be there live. But I like the Friday night studies. It's not as pre-planned as some of these are. But anyway, thanks everyone. And unless somebody has another question, we can all say goodbye. And, I need to turn off the recording as well. So I'll just hang on. Pause to stop.